Howdy, welcome to Modern Musicology. We are here tonight talking about the Beatles. Brand new documentary, Get Back. Got some great guests with me. Rob, what's new? Hang on, he's got to unmute himself.
There we go. Sorry.
There you are.
No, I didn't want to talk during the intro. So
it automatically mutes.
I knew that. I was just testing.
Okay. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. Ashley, what's going on?
Not much. Been spending the last few days watching 8.5 hours of Beatles footage. So that's what I've been doing mostly the last little bit.
And you're on a rewatch.
Yeah, I'm starting. I'm trying to. I was wanting to rewatch a little bit of it.
Yeah,
I didn't get very far in, but I did. I did rewatch some.
Yeah, I wanted to be able to rewatch, but I have not had the opportunity to yet. Okay, so we are going to dive right in. Brand new documentary, Beatles, Get Back. We've been waiting a long time for this. Peter Jackson has been working on this for about the past 4 years. It was first announced a couple of years ago. It was supposed to be out last year, got pushed back to this year. It was supposed to be a theatrical release. It got turned into basically a mini series on Disney Plus, and we finally have it. So without getting too detaily yet, what are your initial thoughts about this? What were your reactions to it?
I'll go. Yeah. So I love this. I was thinking back to just about 25 years ago, and we had the anthology, and it was over Thanksgiving weekend, and so we had this new kind of 3-day Beatles event, kind of almost to the day, 26 years or whatever that is, 24, I guess. I can do math. But it was super. It was super cool to kind of experience this in that way. It took me back to that time, and at that time they did talk about Let It Be, and it was those 2 or 3 pieces that have kind of become notorious, the Paul George argument and a few other things,
right.
and that's kind of what we've known about this. And it really, the cool thing, and I know we're going to talk about this changes a narrative. We don't get to see that in many historical things ever, but especially with music and things like that we think we know everything, and we truly do not in this case.
Yeah, exactly. Rob, what'd you think of it?
First of all, I think this is a textbook for people that are in bands right now that use technology to learn how to make records. Without technology, I think it's like in terms of being a historical document of like, this is how people make records, kids, right? And I think that it's interesting because in most cases, the dynamics of the band are exactly as we thought they were. And sometimes they weren't, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I absolutely loved it. And one of the big things that I discovered from this is that you have to see the entire thing. Like each part kind of works on its own, but you really like part 1 is good, but part 1 makes so much more sense and seems so much more important when you see how the whole thing ends. It's interesting that this whole thing was 1 month, and they only had January of that year to do all this because they had just wrapped up the White Album. George was in America in December, and Ringo was due to start shooting his next movie, which was The Magic Christian, if I remember rightly,
Correct.
at the beginning of February. So they only had January, and they didn't know what they were going to be doing. Was it going to be a television special? Was it going to be a film? Was it going to be a live concert? Was it going to be recording a new album? And so they're doing this stuff starting pretty much from scratch with, and their trajectory changes as they go. And it's a fascinating thing to watch happen.
One thing that amazes me about that is the amount, when you think about story structure, you think about foreshadowing and these things, the amount of foreshadowing that occurs in those first 20 minutes. To the point where maybe we'll just play outside somewhere. It'll be awfully cold.
I know. Yeah.
Who's that? Who's that pianist that plays with Ray Charles, right? And there's like all these bits of foreshadowing that happens that you would write into a story that happens in real life, right?
Exactly. Exactly. It was so interesting that, they kept talking about this song would sound great with a piano part or whatever. And, well, how do we do that? Well, we should add a fifth member to the band. John was big on wanting a fifth member of the band. And I tell you, I was waiting for the moment that Billy Preston walks into the studio. And part two, in he walks. They're like, "Hey, how's it going? Would you like to play on a couple of songs? By the way, you're going to end up on the album." It was so good. And these. Okay, well, let's back up a little bit. Part one, they really come into this with practically nothing. They've got some song ideas. George has got a couple of things, and but really, there's not really anything that they're starting with. They create this album in the studio during this month period, and I just think it's a fascinating thing to watch. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Rob.
Oh, I was going to say what I thought was really interesting, and Alan, you kind of threw some of this out here. They would have an idea, and they're like, "Oh, that'd be cool. Let's play outside." They kind of put it away, and they try to like be more clever than they need to be almost, and then they just go back to doing what the Beatles do, right? And when they bring in Billy Preston, it goes back. It's a really great throwback to. This is a band that grew up liking American black music, right? And it made perfect sense. And it's interesting how, despite how they push the limits with track recordings and overdubs and recording studio techniques and things, right? They still went back to the basics of what made them a great, I use the word bar band in many ways, even though it's not really appropriate, but basically just a band that just goes out and just plays and enjoys playing music.
Right.
And I think it's really interesting. You have these moments of tension and these really stressful moments. And then they pick up their instruments and start playing and it all goes away. And I just think that's really cool. Like, I don't think if the Beatles could just play music and not have to like do anything else, I think they probably would have made it longer.
And I think that's an interesting part about this story is we all know that they stopped touring and they became businessmen really essentially after Epstein died. And you really see that in this, where there's a part that really struck me, and it was when they're done recording and they go, "I'll see you tomorrow," and they even reference this. There was a time where we wouldn't see each other the next day. We just lived with each other. We just kind of lived and breathed this, and it really brings to the forefront that whole thing that many of them have said. We moved on. We got families. We did this. We did that. And I think that moment when I realized this was a working day for them, the same way any of us would go to work to our jobs. It was a job, and I think that shines through pretty well in this. This wasn't just it's just their job. Their 9 to 5 job was being a band, or 11 to 5, or 11 to whatever,
with a scheduled lunch break and everything. I thought it was so interesting. I want to say really quickly, folks who are watching, drop us a comment. Let us know if you watched it this weekend, what you thought of it, what were some of your highlights, some of the important bits that stuck out to you. We want to hear from you. What were some of the revelations that you took away from this?
Get Back came out of nowhere.
Holy smokes. It was amazing to watch that song from nothing and just evolve. Holy cow. That was incredible.
Well, and that kept happening. At one point he goes, "Oh, I came out, I dreamed this one up this morning. It was backseat of my car." That comes out years later on Ram, I think. He, people joke about Paul McCartney being this like songwriting factory, but it's like it just poured out of him. And
exactly.
I mean, when Get Back, he's just strumming and he just starts singing, and it was like us as an audience, we go, whoa, did he just is that the moment that song
came
into existence?
Right.
And it was
right.
And it's on film.
Yeah, it is amazing to me, the birth of all this music that is important in the 20th century musical canon. It's like it's like watching, it's like watching Beethoven create the Fifth Symphony, or like, watching Ellington take the A train. It's like you actually get to see it happen, and it's just like, oh wait, like when I'm like, this is Get Back. This is, oh my, wow. You're kind of at least for me, you're kind of so taken aback, you have to stop and recollect your thoughts.
Yeah.
And then the other thing, and I don't know if you were going to jump on this, Alan, but the other thing too that I thought was really interesting is they're having these conversations about the future of the band and what's going on, and it's always John and Paul going to the cafeteria, or John and Paul having a conversation.
Yep.
And it's like, Ringo, come on. I mean, I felt really kind of sad for Ringo in a way, but in a way then I didn't, because he's the one that kind of got, it's interesting to me because he had this dual life. He got to like live a little more than I think the rest of them did.
Yeah.
Because that pressure wasn't on him. But at the same time, he's not involved in these decisions, and they're almost dismissive of him. And that.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I suspected that, but I wasn't like, didn't think that it was that bad. It's like, well, we're going to the cafeteria, and that conversation with John and Paul in the cafeteria would have went completely different if Ringo's in the middle.
That conversation was fascinating. That was one of the highlights of the whole thing for me. But about Ringo, I got to tell you, I'm a drummer. I love Ringo. I think Ringo is a great drummer. I love his playing. But I'm going to say something that I never thought I would say. I watched this and I realized just how unimportant Ringo was to the creation process. I mean, it's all, John and Paul, of course, but George, pitched in some ideas here and there and got to say, this chord structure or whatever. Ringo sat there on his drum stool and just waited until, they're going to play the song again. And then he puts a really simple beat on it, and that's it. And then he just sits there for another long time. I was blown away. Now, in part 3, I think it was, where George and Ringo are the first ones who get there, and Ringo plays for him on the piano. He's playing Octopus's Garden, and George says, "Oh, that's really good. Let me, maybe this chord progression would be even better." And they kind of work out some parts together.
I thought that was beautiful.
I love that. Love it.
And I think, I think George had to fight tooth and nail, because we know he did want more songwriting room. Right.
Oh, yeah.
And I almost wonder if Ringo, because he's like, there's too many egos in the room, just said, you know what, I'm just going to step back.
Right.
You can't. And I had forgotten to, what makes that scene a little more interesting is George Harrison had an affair with Ringo Starr's wife. So that whole scene takes on a whole new context when you know that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I thought, I never thought Ringo was super important in the creative process, but I thought he was at least, around more, and it wasn't so, and I don't think they were, patronizing or anything. It was just kind of like, he's our session player, it was just kind of, but I will say the scenes, like there's a couple scenes where he's playing piano and he's doing some other things with musical instrument. Like he was a hell of a piano player, which I did not know. And I just, the multi-musicianship of him, I was not really aware of at that particular time. I knew eventually it was, but, and the other Ringo thing I think is interesting too, is just you could see the relationship with Paul sort of moving closer, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I think I would counter that argument about Ringo, and I would actually say that while Paul or John or George or whoever was saying, and this was what the argument was, right? Play it this way. I want you to play it this way. No one ever told Ringo how to play it anyway. They didn't comment on it at like one time.
There was a couple of times,
but it wasn't as straightforward as it was with other people. And I think the thing is they just trusted Ringo to do what he did. And if that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know, but that's what I think that's the difference in that. And he was also just seemed to be happy to be there. He was the first one to get there every morning. And it's just you could see like that Liverpoolian work ethic with him and Paul to some extent, but more so with Ringo.
But it's important to remember that this comes really, really close after they have finished working on the White Album. When Ringo quit, he was gone for 3 weeks when they were working on the White Album. So, it's interesting to see, kind of the dynamics from that point to this. I think it's really interesting. And I'm still a big Ringo fan.
Well, and I would also say, I think something to Rob's point about the relationship with Paul, when they said, well, who wants to go on the roof? And he's like, I want to play on the roof.
I know. Where George is like, I don't want to play on the roof. Why would I want to play on the roof?
and it was kind of like they went around there like, do you want to play? Do you want to play? And Ringo's like, I want to do it. Like, I want to do it.
Ringo was up for it, man.
I thought that was kind of funny.
Yeah. Another thing that really stuck out to me is, we've always had sort of that stereotypical narrative of Yoko destroyed the Beatles. She was there the entire time because John wanted her to be there. She did nothing. She sat there with him. That's all she did. And, it's funny that they had that conversation and Paul mentioned her and said, years down the road, someone may say Yoko broke up the band, but he had no trouble with her. And there were those couple of times in the part 2 and part 3 where they're just sitting around jamming and she's like caterwauling on the microphone, whatever, and they're just having fun. They're having a blast, and there's not the tension that we have been told all this time for decades.
And the funny thing is, there's always been that counter argument that Paul has had. He's like, no, that's not the way it happened. And no one really believes Paul, right?
Right.
I mean, he's written songs about this and books about it and all this stuff, and no one believes him. And now all of a sudden, like, he's kind of vindicated it.
Right. Exactly. That was another really interesting thing was in the absence of Epstein, there was nobody driving the ship anymore. There was nobody taking charge, and Paul had to step in and be the boss. He didn't want to be the boss. He didn't want to be the boss, but no one else was doing it. And he gets a lot of flack for, in some cases from the band members, but from the public for years. And none of that stuff at the end of their career would have happened had Paul not stepped in to be as he said, to be the father, the daddy. And I think that's just really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, he kind of became this almost mogul as he walks in with his. I mean, he's got a. I mean, the room changes when he walks in for good or ill, right?
You're right.
But
right.
He walks in with that coat; it's flowing. He's got that beard, and he comes in and sits down, and then he takes it off, and he becomes a Beatle, right? Yeah. There's almost like this transformation that happens. As he's talking to people and he's doing his thing, and then he comes in and takes it off, and you still kind of see that with Paul, and when you see outtakes of him or whatever, but it's kind of neat to see.
Yeah. The thing that I found most interesting was part 1 all takes place at Twickenham Studios, and they're setting up for what they think is going to be a television shoot, while props are being moved in for the movie that Ringo is going to be working on in February. And you can tell that not everybody wants to be there, like they're doing this because they have to, and they're trying to figure out what their next project is going to be. And it's not until they move to Apple Studios that stuff starts to really click. And it's really interesting to watch the change in John. He seems distant and aloof in part 1. In parts 2 and 3, he starts to warm up, and you start to see the silly John, the freewheeling John, the really creative John. Oh man, I loved it. Julian Lennon, was it Julian? Said after this came out, he said that seeing these films made him love his father again. I just thought that was an incredible statement.
Something that really stood out to me on around that same time, and the end of episode, or the beginning of episode 2, there are kind of two things. One is you see this really human interaction between Paul and Ringo, and then John. This is right before the conversation in the cafeteria. But Paul is like crying, right? I mean, he's on the verge of tears, and Ringo maybe also. And I think this is something that we maybe didn't expect, because I mean, this is 10 years of their life at this point, longer than 10 years really, and it's almost like he's losing something that he doesn't want to lose. And
exactly.
But the other thing that I think, and maybe other people do remember this and I don't, is that John and Ringo turned 29 this year. Paul was 27. And George was 25.
I know.
These were not people who had been doing this for a long time. These are not kids, but very young adults, especially in the case of George. They are young, and they're going through this. And I think the thing that I really enjoyed about that second part is there's a part where they're not doing anything, and like Paul just starts climbing this rope, and he's just doing
right.
And I'm just like, yeah, they're just kids, right?
They're just kids. They really are.
They still want to. I'm not going to. I'm 40, and I'm not going to do that, right? But I don't think at any point, and I don't think of them as that. I think of them as like, so it's kind of. I think that's an important lens to watch this through. Is that they are young.
I didn't think of that really much going in, because you always, like, I had no idea Harrison was that young, for example. I'm just, you always think of them sort of being older than they are because they're the Beatles, and there's this whole mythos about them, right? And I think the big takeaway from this is that even 5-6 decades later, they still hold this like mythic stature that's really interesting. And I really thought, like, when you see McCartney with his beard and he's just sitting there stroking his beard, you're like, ooh, Paul McCartney's stroking his beard. And you're like captivated. Why are you captivated by this, right? It's because it's the mythos of the Beatles. And you get that. And then you get these like conversations on the side that sort of just, every time there's one, it peels that away to where you're like, by episode 3, I think you're looking at them as human beings more than like this big huge band. I think it's interesting how they keep peeling back layers.
And everyone was that age. Even Michael Lindsay Hogg, he points out he's the same age. I looked it up. He's the same age as Ringo and John. So he was 28. He points that out in the movie. He says something about it. George Martin is the only one of any age that is in this, really. Billy Preston may be older. I don't know how old he was, but you come in and you've got Jeff Johns. I don't know how old he was, but he looked about the same age or younger. They're surrounded by young people, which is, there's nothing wrong with that. They're highly talented and highly efficient people, and they do fantastic work. But I just don't think, like Rob, like you said, I don't think we think about that, right? There's this mythos, and these people are almost gods in the industry when you think of it that way. And it's hard to see them as 28, 20, 25, and making these kinds of decisions. It's easy to see the young Beatles as being young. It's hard to see the latter-day Beatles thinking about them as being 28 years old.
Right.
Making these decisions.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remember that this is January of 1970. The first, we think about the Beatles' career as being a 10-year, 11-year career, whatever. The first album comes out in 63. The first single comes out in, I think 62. So we're talking about an 8-year span when the first single comes out to some of the masterpieces that they created in the last half of their career with Mystery Tour and Abbey Road and all these amazing albums that, progressed recording technology in a way that nothing else had. And the way that you record an album in a studio, everything changed because of them. And we're talking about a 7 to 8 year period. That's unbelievable.
It's
had
incredible.
11 albums in that. there are 11 albums
Mm-hmm.
with what typically about 10 to 12 songs on them. Um,
Right.
so not that many songs in the scheme of things.
And it's interesting too that in the beginning of this, the point was made that they were, going into this new project, ideally to have a new album come out of it. And the point was made, the Beatles hadn't released a single in 5 months. Like that was some massive span of time, which for them it probably was because they were constantly churning out material.
Mm-hmm. 5 months. Oh my God.
5 months. Unbelievable.
Yeah. What are we gonna do? I'm a nerd in this part, so I freely admit it. When they're in the studio and they clearly get a package of promo records or whatever, they're taking turns going through the records and picking what they want. You see Lennon look at the Rolling Stones record and kind of look at it, kind of makes a face, and he just sets it down. I thought that was really interesting. And they're going through, and George Harrison just grabs the Smokey Robinson album like right away. It was just kind of an interesting sort of like look inside their head, which I thought was interesting. And I also like, and I'm blanking on the name now again, the guy who had to direct all that, Hogg.
Yeah.
Michael Lindsay Hogg.
Yeah, and we just forget. I keep thinking of 10 other hyphens. It's a great British name. He has the best lines in it, and they're not lines, but he's got the best dialogue in it, and you just sort of by the end of the thing you're like, this guy has to corral this circus. It's like, wow.
Speaking of circus, I'm glad you mentioned that word because we have this Rolling Stones project that John was involved in, that Hogg directed, that was filmed and then never happened. And that kept getting brought up. Like whatever the Rolling Stones were doing, it really seemed like maybe definitely John and maybe Paul were like, look at what they're doing. Why aren't we doing the same kind of thing too?
Yeah, I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
And they kept referencing Clapton too, like, oh, we're gonna call Clapton. It's like,
what happens if George doesn't come back? Oh, we'll just call Clapton.
like, please don't.
So, okay, so George, part one ends with on the cliffhanger of George quitting the band. It was one of the nicest and most congenial splits I've ever witnessed. Like you didn't really see like a big blowout. There wasn't like a big argument or anything like that that sort of led up to it, at least as far as what we saw in Get Back. It's like lunchtime and he's like, well, I think I'm off. I'll see y'all around to the clubs. I think I'm going to quit the Beatles now. And you're like, what? Where did that come from?
Yeah.
I think in that case, there was a lot of things, I guess something happened off camera specifically. Yeah. And apparently it was George and John, not George and Paul.
Yes.
It doesn't really bring that up. I mean, it kind of does when they were reading the papers later.
It does, yes.
But it doesn't come up immediately with that. One of the things kind of surrounding that, this is I've been doing some reading, and I think a lot of people are like, well, George quit the band. There's horrible things going on. Yeah. That was also like the same week or within days of Patty leaving him.
Right.
The first time. Like
right.
They make amends. But so all of this is happening at the same time. And if you remember that day he quits, the guy that was the music publisher was there. And he's like, and George is like, hey, thanks for the gift. And he was just like, yeah, they're great for drinking, or the wife might throw them at you. So there's like all of these things happening.
That's true.
When I mean, and it's that same day, and he's got to be. I mean, there's a lot going on, and it's like the easiest thing to do are these guys who are your friends. When you're in a bad situation, you're going to attack your friends, right? You're going to do that. That's what happens because they're eventually they're going to be okay with it eventually. I mean, I'm sure it's more than that, and I am putting my own spin on it.
Yeah,
but I think it was more than just whatever happened that day with John.
But we've always heard exactly. We've always heard so much about the arguments and the fighting that went on, and what a terrible time it was. And McCartney, when this whole project was announced, said, basically said, I feel like the fights and the arguments have been over exaggerated over the years. There was also a lot of laughing and a lot of fun and a lot of lightheartedness that went on at that same time. And he was really hoping that these films would capture that. And I think it really did, particularly in parts 2 and 3. You see so much of and you really see how much John and Paul love each other. You see, there was that moment where it's just the two of them sitting at a microphone with their guitars and they're playing. And I forget what song it was that they were singing, but they were doing it with clenched teeth, and they were kind of like smiling at each other. And it was hilarious.
Two of us. Yeah.
And they were just having fun.
That was two of us.
Yeah. It also shocked me that the rooftop concert gets pushed back for a day because of weather. So they're basically one day away from playing on the roof, and they haven't finished, all the songs yet. And they're still in the studio just playing Chuck Berry songs, just horsing around and stuff. And I thought that was kind of eye-opening.
So the whole time, Michael Lindsay Hogg is trying to get them to decide on a venue to do this,
right?
And
exactly.
they've decided. There's a scene in the second part where they've decided to not do it. They're like, we're probably not going to do it. And then they come over and someone whispers in his ear, and he goes, "Hey, this is a good idea." And you kind of see it happening. And then there's this scene, and it might be the funniest thing I've ever seen. They go up to the roof, and it's Paul and I don't know who else, maybe Jeff Johns, someone else, and they have to pull Michael Lindsay Hogg up. He's like a fish. He just flops down onto the ground to the point where I had to back it up to see who it was. And I realized it's like he's never used muscles in his entire life.
I missed that.
When you got to see this part, when he climbs up on the roof, and it was the strangest thing, but they're going up and they're looking at it. And again, you see that Paul's jumping around the roof, and he's jumping down here and checking it out. And it's fun to see them so vibrant. And then Michael Lindsay Hogg is just like a fish. They have to pick him up and pull him. And Paul McCartney's pulling Michael Lindsay Hogg up on this thing. It's hilarious.
Was it Hogg in the first part mainly, but I think it came up in the second part too, who kept talking about, we should do this in the desert with torchlight? Dude, let that torchlight go.
But what he kept saying is in front of 500 Arabs. And he uses that word, and I'm just like, oh man, let's not.
And then he does the weird Pakistani voice too, which I'm like, oh my god,
I didn't catch that.
Yeah.
Okay, speaking of Pakistanis, I'm going to tell you the thing that blew me away more than anything else. I mean, there was a lot of stuff that really, surprised me. The thing that really got me was that we saw Get Back from its origin through its evolution, and then they come to it and they say, you know what, we should turn this into a protest song against white supremacists. And I was like, holy smokes. And so he redoes the lyrics to where, telling someone to get back to where you once belong is telling Pakistanis and other nationalities to leave and go back where you came from.
Yeah.
Where it was basically making fun of white supremacists. And I was amazed by that.
I didn't know about that. I
didn't either. I was shocked.
I was like, oh, it was interesting because I knew at that time John was far more political than the rest of them.
Oh, yeah.
But it was interesting that it was I didn't realize it dipped into their music that far, which I thought was interesting. And the fact that they are clearly funneling, and you see this throughout the whole thing, they're funneling the outside world into what's going on in ways they didn't do before, from the idea of doing a live album because they liked playing that live session to Paul reading the article, the paper while they're playing with the voice. They clearly are much more aware of who they are in this one than we've seen in other things. So
Right. And Ashley, there was one that you were watching it a little bit ahead of me, and there was one that you pointed out to me that you said make sure you watch for this. That was another thing that really, really surprised me.
Yeah, and that was the my mind's blank. I know what it is, but it was not Golden Slumbers.
Carry That Weight.
Carry That Weight was originally going to be a comedy song for Ringo to sing.
Ringo. I mean, a completely different tempo, completely different feel.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And that song, it's so different than what it ended up being.
Yeah.
But all these little things kind of come through, and you see these versions of songs and ideas, and even songs that you don't even that aren't even Beatles songs. Like I said, Backseat of My Car.
Right.
I think
All
Teddy
Things
Boy's
Must Pass.
there. All Things Must Pass.
I love seeing Beatles sitting around playing All Things Must Pass together.
And this was really interesting. Give Me Some Truth. If you've so they're playing this, and there's an interview with Peter Jackson, and he's like, I asked Paul about that. He's like, I didn't help John with that song. He's like, yeah, you did. He's like, no, I never played it with him. And he's like, I pulled my iPad out and showed him, and he was just like, I have no memory of that. And then he said, with a twinkle in his eye, he goes, good song though, huh?
Oh, that's fantastic. Wow.
But yeah, it's fascinating.
I gotta talk about George for a second. First of all, today is the 20th anniversary of his passing.
Yeah.
I mean, this documentary could not have been better timed. But also, it's interesting to hear Beatles rehearsing All Things Must Pass, because at the end of the film, he says to John, I only ever get like 2 songs per album. I've got enough material amassed right now for the next 10 Beatles albums. I should do a solo record. You could tell that he was just practically out the door at that point. I mean, and it's a shame too, because I think he's one of the greatest songwriters ever. And Here Comes the Sun, I think, is one of the greatest pop records ever written by anybody. I think it's an absolute masterpiece. And there's so much stuff that they missed out on by George not getting an opportunity to do very much in the band. And it's a shame. He's my favorite Beatle, by the way.
Yeah.
So I found it really interesting to watch. I always, my eyes just stayed on George pretty much the whole time, just to see how he was reacting to the stuff that was going on around him. I found it really interesting.
I also love the fact too that he's the one taking the most interest in when they're filming the documentary. He's like looking at the cameras. You kind of see him like slowly walking around looking at the camera and things, you could tell that he's really kind of thinking outside the box. And then when Peter Sellers comes by, he's kind of like, oh, it's Peter Sellers,
right.
Which I thought was interesting.
One of the things that was interesting also, especially in that dynamic between George and Paul and John, John and Paul are kind of talking, and they're talking kind of philosophical about Hinduism and some of those things that they talked about in India when they're kind of looking back. And they say something, I don't remember what they said, but it's kind of slagging off what they had done. And George is like, whoa, none of this matters. Like, and you can see that, like, he's kind of known as the mystic Beatle or the spiritual Beatle, and it kind of comes through there where he's kind of defending this belief system that he's developing, and that does define the rest of his life. And you can see it kind of like him beginning to kind of like, no, none of this that we're doing matters, and I thought that was interesting too, and to think about kind of his belief system and how the others felt about that, which was also interesting because there was a movie that came out on VH1 in 2000, I think, called Two of Us. And it's where John and Paul meet. And that is directed by Michael Lindsay Hogg.
Wow.
There is a scene in that movie where they talk about how they want to, they still kind of do the meditation thing, which is funny because in this movie that Michael Lindsay Hogg directs, they're like, yeah, we don't do that, in 1969. So it's kind of this weird, like, how well were you listening to what was going on there?
Right.
I mean, it was a fictitious experiment, but it was directed by Michael Lindsay Hogg, so that's where those two things connect.
Very interesting. All right. So, what are some of the other things that you that really stood out to you? Maybe a song or a particular performance. I think it's really interesting that they finally get up to the roof, and you know, over the past month, we've seen these songs that came from nothing and they struggle with the arrangements on them. And they're like, I don't know which way this song should go, this way or this way or whatever. And they keep like kind of putting stuff off. And well, we'll come back to that one later and whatever. When they finally get to the roof, they are so together. They are so like ready to play. And three of the performances on the roof are the ones that end up on the album. It blows me away that that they got album quality recordings, performances, I should say, during that rooftop show. That's just amazing. That what we hear on the record is absolutely live. I think it's just incredible.
Well, that shows
you. Go ahead, Rob.
I was going to say that shows you how far ahead they were too with the idea of recording and mixing. And I loved watching, how they fiddle around with gadgets. Like when he brings in the bass guitar, that's also a guitar.
Right.
It's like how much like little kids they became when that stuff happens. And the fact that they were always sort of looking at technology. Yeah, I thought was interesting.
Yeah.
So I think the interesting thing is I that's one of the things I actually don't know a ton about. I've not really researched like what was done on there. And for some reason in my head, I had this idea that they had done like a complete show. They just played the same 5 songs over and over, right?
Yeah,
they
exactly.
played them like 3 or 4 times a piece. And they did that for 45 minutes to get the best take. And it truly was just a recording session. It was just on the roof and not in the studio.
Right. I was listening to one of the talk shows on the talk radio on Sirius XM volume. It's a talk show all about music. And so I was listening to one of the shows today, and Alan Light says that I heard the song Get Back more times this weekend than I've ever heard in my life. And I think that's pretty funny.
Yeah.
I also want to talk about Billy Preston, because everything that, he walks into the studio and it changes the mood. It changes. Part of it is that his parts so well from hearing these songs for your whole life that they don't sound complete until you hear him sitting down at the electric piano and playing. So, you hear Get Back and a couple of other things and you're like, it sounds good. Billy sits down and you're like, now it's that song that I know. And he just blows me away. I think he's an amazing guy. And just to see how much fun he had just hanging out with the Beatles and playing these songs. I mean, he came in basically just to say hi, and they said, hey, you want to play on a couple of songs? And he was there for the next 2.5 weeks.
Yeah.
That's unbelievable. All right. I got a comment I want to get to really quickly. This is my buddy Dan, who lives in Scotland. Hey, I've only seen episode 1 of Get Back, but I love seeing the song Get Back being written. That was one of my absolute favorite points of the whole film. I thought that was just incredible. So anyway, Billy Preston.
So and the funny thing is the way it's shot, and I don't know if it just is happenstance or what, but I don't think he has a single, he doesn't say a single thing he's just smiling the whole time, right? Every time it shows him, he's just like agreeing with whatever's being said, or, and there's one scene where they're like, well, what's that chord? What's that chord? And he's like, oh, it's this. And he's like showing the Beatles how to play things on the piano. And I think at one point, John says, this electric piano's out of tune. And he goes, electric pianos can't go out of tune.
Right.
And John's like, oh, okay. And just walks off. Yeah. No one's going to argue with Billy Preston, right?
It's great that he's sort of like the one guy that can shush them. He equally shushes everybody, which I think is great.
I love he just this past week, or it was a couple of weeks ago, but it just got broadcast this last week, as him being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame right before this film comes out. And I think that you see, this is just one. I mean, this is the thing that most people know about him. He had a couple of big hits in the 70s, but people know him as the Beatles guy. He almost was the fifth Beatle. This is one little tiny chapter of his career. But I think it's so fun to see that chapter really come to life.
He was also in the Beatles rock opera with the Bee Gees.
That's right. He sure was.
He sang "Get Back."
Yes, he did. Absolutely.
Oh wow! Yeah, I forgot that.
I was listening to radio today, and the Aerosmith version of "Come Together" came on, and I was like, "Oh, there's that film." So anyway, what time we got? We still got a few minutes. What are some other thoughts that you've got about it?
So one thing that got me is in the mythos of the Beatles is Mal Evans, who was their road manager.
Oh yeah,
man, did they run poor Mal Evans to death? They're just like, I'd like to see someone do a cut of every time someone said, "Hey Mal," and it was like, but I mean, he was there, right? He was so instrumental in everything they did. He was the one writing the lyrics down as they were just coming up with stuff. He was the one like, "Hey, get a hammer." They literally said, "Hey Mal, get a hammer."
Yes.
And do this thing for Maxwell Silverhammer.
Yeah.
And and he's like, "Hey Mal, can I get cauliflower instead of whatever?" And it was everything. I mean, Mal Evans was just run to death. And there's a lot of things that he said that he always felt like he was unappreciated, and I guess I can kind of see that.
Sure.
He was such a vital part, and it shows, right? I mean, he's there. He is there in almost every scene of this movie. Mal Evans is there, and for him to, I'm sure he did feel underappreciated because I mean he was doing everything, and he had been there with them since the beginning. I think at least early on, right?
Yeah,
and he just just that to see him kind of do those things and see how important he was is unfortunate that he didn't get more
agreed
kind of respect in that.
Dan says, seems like they were a bit rudderless following Brian Epstein's passing.
Yes,
that is absolutely the case. Yeah,
because
go ahead. Sorry,
I was going to say, if Epstein's around for all of this, they have a plan. They have the shooting schedule. It's all pre-made.
Yeah,
it's like you show up this time. It's like they just literally. Part of the reason they could be as famous as they were when they started is because Epstein pretty much was running so much everything on time. It's just basically they had to show up and be on, right? And then Epstein's gone, and suddenly they got to do the work. It's kind of like when you're in school and you have a substitute teacher for, all the time, and then the real teacher shows up, and you actually have to do the homework. It's kind of like that. And I just thought, how different this album would have sounded, and how different the Beatles would have sounded if Epstein had gone so soon.
Yeah. That's true.
And that's a melancholy that sort of hangs over the film. It's not really talked about.
Yeah.
But it's sort of this thing that's hanging around, which I think is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that's interesting because you do see that, and you see the fact that one thing that I kept thinking about is like, why wasn't this planned going into it? Like, why didn't they have this whole thing worked out before day one, but they just start filming?
Yeah.
I don't know. We'll just figure it'll emerge, right?
Yeah.
And I think in my mind, the Beatles were bigger than that. They had people, they had this stuff, but they didn't really let that happen. They wanted things to emerge, and like that would never happen now, right? I don't think there's anyone now that's that big that would just go in and be like, let's do a TV special. Well, what's it going to be about? We'll figure it out.
The thing that surprises me is that when they finally do abandon the idea of doing a television special, they keep filming. And they think, well, maybe we'll use all this to make our third film because we still owe one to the studio. But the fact that they didn't have a plan for the television thing, whatever it was that it was going to be, and when they ended that, they just said, well, we'll just keep the cameras around. Let's just keep filming. I mean, you would only get half of this story had they said, we don't need this camera crew anymore. I mean, we're so fortunate to have as much as we have.
that's an interesting point too, is how much, like there's 50 or 60, almost 60 hours of this, and we get 8.5. Like, what didn't make it into the film? Like, and that's what I keep asking myself. Like, Peter Jackson, I think, has said that he wanted to tell this happy story. And I do question him, like, is there things that just didn't make it into the film
Oh yeah,
because it didn't feed into that? Or are there those bad moments that, you know,
right.
and maybe we're just seeing the 8 hours of good moments, right?
Exactly.
Well, and also Ringo and George or Ringo and Paul are producers. So how much of that? How much were they active in being producers? You know,
Right. Okay. Dan has a question for us. Hang on. Do we think that they used studio session musicians during Abbey Road? After hearing the early versions of Maxwell's, I started wondering if that was perhaps the case. So, as far as I know, the only ones that are credited on Abbey are Billy Preston plays keyboards on something and something else. I don't remember what else. And George Martin does some keyboardy stuff, some extra percussion.
mm-hmm.
If I remember rightly, I think some harpsichord or something like that. But that's the only ones that we know of.
So there's that's interesting because Abbey Road is incredibly documented, well documented. There's a book, and the name of it does not come to mind. I talked about it the last time I was on, talking about Paul McCartney. It's amazing these records still exist. Like, they knew like what day, what hour, like what instrument was played, right? The records, like George Harrison used this room to use this instrument to record it this way. Like, the records are astounding. So we know exactly who played on those records. And no, that's not the book. I'll find it.
And I loved how they labeled everything, like how meticulously everything was labeled. Like, you knew what the song was, who the composer was. I loved all of that. I thought that was really cool, you know. But you knew when what was in the Beatles song, what was, you know. I just thought that was all pretty cool.
Yeah. Ashley is busy looking for this book and doesn't realize he's muted.
It is called Solid State is the name of the book.
Oh yeah, that's right. I remember you mentioning that last time you were on.
By Kenneth Womack. Alan Parsons does the foreword to that book as well, who is in this movie. Yeah, it's quite a good read.
I saw on the rooftop. What song is it that they're about to do? And John's like, I don't know that I'll remember the lyrics. And this kid comes up and holds the lyrics up for John to read off of, like he's his own like teleprompter. Somebody on one of the Facebook groups that I'm in today posted, somebody's done an interview with that kid that held the lyrics.
Wow.
I know. Isn't that amazing? I haven't got to read it yet. I just saw it before we came on to do this, but I'm looking forward to reading that.
I think something that we should talk about too is the way that rooftop concert is edited is astounding. Where you see all these different views, not just of the rooftop, but also of what's going on in the offices and on the street, and specifically when the police start coming in. And it is an interesting. I think as much as it's an interesting history of the Beatles, it tells you a lot about like policing in that area of London during 1969. It seemed to, I've never been there, I don't know, but I imagine it seemed to be a pretty posh area of London. So so I mean, there's a lot of people that were like, those noisy kids up on the roof, they're disrupting the way things work. And it was 45 minutes. It actually didn't seem like it was that loud. Other than it was the Beatles, so anything the Beatles do, they're going to bring a crowd, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that like all these people, what I loved are the people, even some of the older people, they were like, "Yeah, it's the Beatles, we love them."
Yeah.
And then some other people and then there's one where it's this one young kid who's just like, "No, they don't need to be doing that."
I know.
And
That was hilarious.
hilarious.
And the one older woman who was like, well, they've just disturbed my nap. I don't like it. I want to see an interview with that lady.
I don't think that lady's still alive.
I don't think she's still around, sadly. Oh, but that was so funny. But it was really interesting to see those three different perspectives. And the one guy that came into the office, well, first of all, as cops and whoever else are coming into the office, and how the receptionist and a couple of other people are trying to deflect them. Oh, I'm so sorry. They're recording a new album, and it's not soundproofed very well. That was just unbelievable. But then the one guy who comes in and he's like, I own the building and I want to know what all this racket is going on my building, and who all these people are. And the girl says, there's nobody on the building. And he says, my building is the one across the street where the extra camera and a couple of recordists were. And he's like, what are those people doing on my building? And she goes, I don't know anything about those people, sir.
And I wonder how much of that they were told to just like, look, if anyone comes, you just deflect. You
Exactly.
just do whatever.
Exactly right.
And then how much of it is just like they were just used to doing that because it was the Beatles and they work for the Beatles and who knows what they're doing. There's an outtake on Abbey Road on the deluxe version where someone's like complaining, right? And they're like, first of all, can you imagine being the guy complaining, saying the Beatles are too loud? Yeah. But apparently everyone does on this. And it's that same thing. It's just like, they're the Beatles. But, hindsight's 50-50, I guess.
I also wonder if
2020, 50-50, 2020. Wow.
Hindsight is whatever you want it to be.
Sure.
I also wonder if when the police come in and they're like, we've had noise complaints and you have to stop this or we're going to start arresting people, they never really do anything. I wonder if even they were like, we know this is the Beatles. We don't want to have to, get in their faces and, break up their thing. But, George was even talking about, wouldn't it be really cool if, the film ends with us being arrested and dragged away and all this kind of stuff, and nothing happens. They finish their show and that's it.
Well, that's another one of those like foreshadow pieces, right? Where they talk about that early on. They're like, wouldn't it be great if the police came and dragged us off?
Exactly.
In episode 1.
Right.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Dan says, I also thought it was interesting to see the control room coming together at Twickenham. And Peter Jackson saying the Beatles apparently didn't understand that they could simply ask for the film recording to temporarily be turned off. That is interesting. Also, when John and Paul go to the cafeteria or wherever it is to have their little, one-on-one headbutt, which was also the most polite headbutt I've ever seen. And the narration, the caption on the film said, no cameras were allowed, but, these little recording devices were snuck in there. That's amazing. I mean, that's kind of an invasion.
I think one of the things that people are saying now, people are beginning to say this, and Michael Lindsay Hogg did a very good job directing this film. And I think Peter Jackson even is like, look, don't give me all the credit for this. I'm just editing these pieces together.
Yeah.
But those things were amazing. He did such a good job directing that and putting that together. Yeah. And I hope he gets the credit he deserves because he did a fantastic job.
Yeah, I think he will.
Yeah. I think there should be a maybe 2.5 hour condensed version for the more casual fan, because I just don't think that everyone's going to sit around and watch 8.5 hours of the Beatles tuning guitars and trying to figure out a chord structure for a song and stuff. I think that there should be like a smushed together, like a little bit more, briskly edited version for the more casual fan, and let those of us who sit around and do podcasts about these kind of things have the 8.5 hour version and, satisfy both parts of the audience.
I love the fact that like you get to see how songs are made.
Yes.
Like how pop songs are made.
Yes.
It's just great. Right. And at the same time, I've seen on Facebook people I know saying I just couldn't sit through it. You know, it was just too long and self-indulgent and blah blah. Well, you're a Beatles fan, but you're not, and I get that because I think people sort of have their own preconceptions of what this is going in.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
and it's a commitment. I mean, you're like, okay,
yeah. At the same time, though, I have been in lots of bands, and it was really, really satisfying for me to see that even the Beatles, get bored with having to, tune a guitar and having to wait for the one guy to figure out what part he's going to play. And, all the downtime that comes in when you're doing this kind of thing, where you just sit around waiting for something or someone to do whatever it is they have to do. You would eventually get to that part where you get on the rooftop and you play phenomenally well. But the rehearsing and the perfecting and the composing is so tedious. And I really appreciated that the Beatles struggle with it too. It's not just, stupid amateur schlubs like me, and people that I've known who sit around in bands in their garage who struggle with this kind of stuff. The fucking Beatles struggled with it too. And
yeah.
I was like, dude, I could be a Beatle. I could never be a Beatle.
I think also is how technical the Beatles were, right? I mean, maybe not all of them, and maybe not all the time, but they had a pretty good working knowledge of the way that studio worked, especially George.
Yeah.
And like George was lending his own equipment, and were he went to help put the studio together.
Yeah.
Like I like that. Like that gearhead mentality, because I'm kind of like that. I like to put things together. I like that. And I like to know that the Beatles didn't just walk in and expect things to work. I mean, they still had their techs. They still had, they relied on Jeff Johns quite a bit. But it was still, they had a pretty good working knowledge of what that was like.
Yeah. All right. We're a little bit over an hour. Final thoughts? The big sigh.
Beatles Flux was great. No,
stop.
Well, I noticed George has her scarf. Yeah, it was, going into this, because you've had a huge buildup, right? And we had a huge buildup that was interrupted, and then it's coming out this year and then pushed back. So it's like this thing that you've been waiting for and waiting for and waiting for. And usually when you have something that's pushed off this much and you keep going through all this, it either becomes not worth your time or the payoff isn't what it's, what it's billed as. It's everything they said it was. If you're a Beatle fan, and the thing is too, this is it. There's not much left. I mean, this is now everything out into the world. There's no, it's not like Prince where there's like just so much stuff in the vault, right? And I mean, this is we're not going to get very much more video of them. We're not going to get, a behind the music with VH1. I mean, this is pretty much what we're going to get, and it's been more enlightening than most of the other documentary stuff that's been made by just letting them sort of do their thing.
Right.
There was some talk about, I've seen some things where it's indulgent and maybe self-indulgent of Peter Jackson to put so much. But I think it goes to say that exactly what you were saying. He is a fan, and he's like, look, if I don't put this out there, it may never get out. So I'm going to put as much as I possibly can as a resource in this. And so people will see this, because originally it was 6 hours, and then it just became 8.5, right? He put an extra hour of 2.5 hours in there. So I think that's fantastic that he was able to do that and was allowed to do that, because there was a 6-hour cut that was approved essentially. And he's like, let's see what else I can put in. So I think that's super important.
And he's got great. And he's got the access to, two of the Beatles and Widows. They don't all agree on allowing access.
Right. That's true.
And getting Yoko, I think, is a huge thing not to necessarily deny about, because she is very guarded with that legacy.
And Yeah, and what's really interesting is I haven't seen any interviews with her. I haven't seen any interviews with Paul since it's come out. I haven't seen anything with Ringo. I saw something with Ringo from like about 2 or 3 weeks ago, but they've all been pretty mum on this, which is interesting. Peter Jackson's doing all of the press, so. But my final thoughts, I just have to echo what Rob said. It's we have this treasure trove given to us as fans of this, which seems weird. It's just like, well, you're just watching a bunch of guys make stuff, but no, you're seeing Get Back appear out of nowhere. I mean, the song didn't exist, and then it did, and we see it from the very second that it becomes a German of an idea. And I don't know if I ever thought that would be something that really was great, but seeing that and then seeing how, someone said, hey, with Let It Be, what if you do da 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 da, like, and you add that in. That wasn't even part of the song, and I think it was Jeff Johns is like doing it, and he's like and that wasn't even part of the song. You see these little things that have become part of the mythos,
right?
And we see it at its infancy, and that's like this real powerful thing that we're given. Like we're given this almost holy book, this holy text of this. You get to see these things exist, like come into the ether, and it's just fascinating to see the creative process from someone from a group that is just so I'm a big Paul McCartney fan, so seeing him just like these songs just roll off his tongue and roll off his fingers playing, it's just fascinating. I've never seen anything like it.
And I love the fact that you see them do songs, you're like, oh, he's going to use that later, it's kind of that's kind of cool, all for
one last real quick thing to get in. Dan says part 1 was great to watch. Really looking forward to watching the next 2 parts eventually, but pacing myself because it's so good. I agree. My final thought is this is something that I've said a couple of times over the last couple of days, is that from this point on, I will never listen to Let It Be the same way again, because having seen that album come into fruition from basically nothing, changes everything about all the way that I've always listened to that album. It has a completely new meaning to me at this point. You can't hear any of those songs and not think of the way that it originated because of the footage that we've now seen. But my final thought is that it only just really occurred to me as we're doing this discussion that I will never listen to Abbey Road the same way again, because we saw the origins of it, half of that album in this film. We got to see George working on something. We got to see Maxwell come together. We saw Paul rehearsing Oh Darling. We saw Ringo, playing for the very first time for one of the other Beatles, Octopus's Garden. I mean, we got a mention. I don't think we ever heard any of it, but we got a mention of Mean Mr. Mustard. We heard a little bit of Polythene Pam. There was so much of Abbey Road that was already happening as they're working on this. So basically, this has changed my entire perspective on the final 2 Beatles albums. And I can't wait to listen to them again, to listen to them in a new way. So there you go.
And another thing that's really great is there isn't a single mention of Phil Spector in this, right? I mean, he's so connected with Let It Be, for good or ill, mostly ill, that you don't have to worry about that.
But his part all happened after,
later, right?
Yeah. And Dan reminds me, Carry That Weight. Yeah. That was one of the most mind-boggling parts of that film, was Carry That Weight almost ended up very differently. And my friend Jim says the documentary simply proves we all, no matter who we are, have lives, trials, tribulations, ups and downs, coming of age, maturing, loves and losses. That time for the Beatles proves they were at the height of life's lessons. That is a final thought if I've ever heard it. That's brilliant.
That's actually a really great
killer summation. Oh man. So Rob, where can folks see and hear more of you if they want to see and hear more of you, which I'm sure they do?
Well, I would like to say you will see more of me on future editions of this very program.
Yes, you will.
With the gifted and talented Anthony Williams,
yes,
as well, England's sweetheart. So yeah, I do a radio show on KDHX in St. Louis. That's every Wednesday night. It's called Juxtaposition. It's streaming online though, so if you're on a Saturday and you're not doing anything and you want to fall asleep, you can listen to it. I also do some stuff for needcoffee.com, and I've been writing my Doctor Who blog again for anglotopia.net, and I'm going to do a couple other things for them, some book stuff and film stuff in the coming weeks as well.
Cool. So Ashley, what else you have going on, Buster?
I don't have
Buster. Speaking of Buster,
yeah. I don't have a lot going on. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, islear.com, or islear at islear, IZLEAR. And I don't do much on it these days. I am working on a role-playing game called The Gun Belt. So if you are interested in a game, if you're interested in role-playing games, this one particularly is about cowboys and dinosaurs and robots. That takes place on a corporation world out in the on a different planet. So that one hopefully will go to Kickstarter next year.
Dan, I was wondering what the time difference was between us and you right now, and apparently it's 3 a.m. What the hell are you still doing up at 3 a.m.? Anyway, I'm so glad that you hung out with us and pitched in some comments and questions. We really appreciate it. And Jim, you too. Thanks so much for commenting. So I gotta say, my T-shirt has been, kind of poking up, but I gotta say, I gotta get where you can see George and Ringo. They never made it on screen, because everything's all about those other two guys. So I do a Star Trek podcast. It comes out on Mondays. So today was a new episode. We've been reviewing the recent episodes, the newest episodes of Discovery, and talking about some topics from legacy shows. And that's what I've got going on. So I hope you guys had a great time. Thank you so much for joining me and talking about this, especially you, Ashley. I have been waiting for the past year plus to talk to you about this documentary. I'm so glad we finally got the opportunity to do it.
Absolutely. The worst part about it not being a theatrical release is I was going to come down and watch this with you.
Oh man,
when it came down, but in lieu of that, we get to do this, and that's equally as fun.
Exactly. All right, so folks watching, thank you so much. Take care. Rob and I will be back next time with. I don't even know what our next topic is going to be, but we will have Anthony Williams with us again. He was unable to watch the documentary this weekend, so he didn't have anything to contribute to tonight's show, sadly. But Ashley, I'm so glad you were able to join us. So everybody take care. Have a great week. We will see you very, very soon. Take care and go listen to more Beatles. All right. So take care, everybody.